Okay, so we're back for Genesis Part 2. I hope you've been watching the Bible Project videos. I think they're very helpful, especially since I am going to skip over some of the stuff that is covered in those. They're in the playlist. I hope that they are working for you. So today we're going to talk about the idea of Abraham and what we see in the book of in the family of Abraham. We see this man Abraham who's called out from the people of Babylon. We said in the last episode that Babylon is the seat of evil, right? It is the place of sin. And so Abraham is called out of that. See? Leave sin, leave that family, leave that network that's going to rebel, and go to a land that I have promised you where I will make you a great nation. That's the promise of Abraham. It's really great and clever. This is where obviously we're starting. The author, while we're always going to have some theological overtones and we're always going to be primarily talking theology rather than history, the author is starting to incorporate more and more and more history into these books, into the book. So Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, they start to incorporate more and more historical details, but you'll see that they're still written primarily for the theological content, not necessarily the historical content. So what we have is Abraham, this man who's called from Babylon. He is the father of nations, we call him. He's told to get up and go, leave your family, and go to the land that I show you. Get up, leave your family, go to the land I show you. What does he do? He gets up, he takes his family with him. Remember, he takes Lot. And he goes to the land and promptly leaves it for Egypt. In other words, he falls flat. He's given this command by God in chapter 12, and he just does his own thing. That sounds so much like us. That's what we end up doing very, very often, where we just decide, well, we're going to do our own thing and we're going to leave. And what happens time and time again? From Abraham, his first interaction is with Lot. And we see that from Lot, because Lot and Abraham can't get along, from Lot, we have this terrible story after the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah of the birth of Moab and the Ammonites. The two people groups that were really at odds with Israel are conceived through incest because of Lot. Had Abraham left Lot behind, in other words, this is what the story is trying to imply. This is why all these little details about Lot are given. The story is trying to imply if Abraham would have listened to the call, nothing bad would have happened with the Moabites, who become a real thorn in Israel's side throughout later books. We see in the story of Abraham going down to Egypt right after he's called to the Promised Land. Abraham goes down to Egypt, and in his mind, he has to lie. In other words, he takes everything for his survival into his own hands, and it almost ends up really bad, where he would have left with nothing. God, though, shows pity on him, which is the other major theme throughout Genesis. God showing pity on the people who can't do things for themselves. And Abraham returns to the land with the promise still intact. So here we are, Abraham coming out of Egypt. He's coming back to the Promised Land. He's disobeyed God twice. And Sarah looks at Abraham and says, hey, I can't have kids, so why don't you force this woman, Hagar, to sleep with you? Because you own her and you're allowed to do that. and we will have kids. Now, Abraham does this. Again, here we should remember Lamech from Cain's line, who took 2 wives, and that ended badly. Now we have Abraham, the second man in the Bible to take 2 wives, and it ends badly. Go figure. We got a running theme here. Abraham takes Hagar, and they have a son together, Ishmael. I already said that Lot's descendants are going to be thorns in the side of the people of Israel. Well, the first time we meet Ishmaelites, they're the ones who buy Joseph and take him to Egypt. They become somewhat neutral, somewhat a thorn for the Israelites. In other words, they're a little neutral, somewhat, at least in the Old Testament, but they become a neutral to evil in the sight of the Bible. They're not good characters. They're not helpful. In other words, again, Abraham tried to do things his own way and it ended badly. And it's going to continually become bad for his descendants. We see that today in Israeli-Arab relations. Many Arabs trace their ancestry through Ishmael, the son of Abraham. And so there's still, in many ways, family tension and family hostility through these 2 sons of Abraham. Now, does that mean that Abraham's family cannot live in unity? No, of course not. In fact, what we ought to see as we talk to Israelites, as we talk about Jews today and Arabs today, we ought to be able to say, hey, your family, let's work this out. So far, that doesn't seem to be happening, but hey, we never know. But we have now 2 nations that come from Abraham. And after Sarah dies, he's going to have other children, and they're all going to be nations that pop up from time to time. Most of them neutral towards Israel. A couple of them might have been helpful. We see Moses' father-in-law is a descendant of Abraham and is helpful. So there is that. But Abraham becomes the father then, literally, of many peoples, many nations. But this is, time and time again, he has to understand the covenant. God appears to him in chapter 12, says, make a covenant. Abraham commits to leave. God appears again in chapter 15 to make a covenant because Abraham just can't stick to it. And then again in chapter 17, we see another covenant with Abraham. And it's immediately after this one that Abraham makes that decision. He's going to start acting like God. He intercedes for the people of Sodom. He starts to see beyond himself, and he starts to look out for other people. And he begins to trust God, which leads us to chapter 22 and the highlight of Abraham and kind of the Abraham story. And that is the sacrifice of Isaac, where in the beginning of all of this mess, Abraham listened to God, but then took matters into his own hands. Well, here in the Isaac story in Genesis 22, Abraham listens. God says, sacrifice this son who I've given you to be the people for my blessing. And Abraham just says, okay. That leads to a lot of difficult questions for many in our culture today about child sacrifice and other things that we don't have time to go into. Maybe I'll do a video one of these days on that. But it shows what the story is trying to show us is that Abraham finally gets it. Finally just takes hands off the wheel and says, God, go ahead. I'm going to follow. And this becomes important for Abraham. This is the transition mark where Abraham acts like God. And Abraham finally says, okay, God is the author of right and wrong. I need to listen to him. And that is, for us today, a major theme, because that is the antithesis of what Adam and Eve did in chapter 3. Abraham's starting to reverse what's going on in chapter 3. Isaac then, he gets married, and then we have Jacob and Esau, who are the progeny of Isaac. Esau, again, will become a kingdom, a people that kind of oppresses or fights with Israel. Edom, they will come up again and again, especially when we hit the book of Obadiah. Edom will be there. And these two have a real bad time. Jacob and Esau, Isaac and Rebekah are just terrible. They are an awful family. Isaac and Rebekah play favorites. Jacob is constantly trying to deceive Esau and take things from him. Esau is violent towards Jacob. This is just a terrible family. And yet they're the family that God chooses to use. And at the end of the story, at the end of Jacob and Esau's lives, they've grown. Jacob and Esau make amends. Jacob is giving instead of taking. Esau is peaceful instead of violent. You see, in other words, after years and years of working with God and encountering God in different ways, Jacob and Esau begin to act like brothers should. They never get all the way there. There's always a little tension between them. But they become brothers. But Jacob has to wrestle with God. Jacob has to be deceived by Laban. Jacob has to go through a lot of ordeal to get there. That's part of the arc of Jacob's story. And it's what we really should be focusing on as we read those chapters from 25 to 34, is just kind of, what is Jacob going through that eventually he gets to the place where he can be at peace with God? And then what does Esau go through? We're never really told what Esau goes through. But at the end, he is a much more peaceful man, and we understand that he seems to have had encounters with God, which also tells us that just because God has chosen a certain group of people, a certain particular family, in this case Jacob's family, that doesn't mean that Esau is excluded from God. In fact, it means Esau can be part of the people, just in a different way. In other words, even as we kind of narrow our focus in the Bible on Abraham and his descendants through Isaac, Jacob, and then Jacob's 12 sons, that doesn't mean that God is excluding everyone else. It means that God is trying to do something special through this group of people while still reaching out to all these other groups of people. I think the ultimate ideal would have been if Esau and Ishmael and all of these other descendants of Abraham would have united together. I think that would have been the ideal, but that doesn't happen because we are human and we need a lot of growth before we can get there. But that's the Jacob cycle. And then we go to, after Jacob, we have Joseph. And Joseph becomes the key figure, even though at the end of the story in chapter 49, as Jacob lays dying, he blesses Judah above all of his brothers. Judah becomes the one who inherits the promise. Joseph is the focal point of the story for this. And it's his dealings where he has to learn humility. He goes from proud, bragging, favored son to literally nothing, and learns the presence of God in the dungeon, and then comes up and is able to work with God to save the people. and to reunite all of his brothers. That's kind of what we should see. That's the arc we should see in Joseph. That he starts out as this arrogant little man, as he has dreams and visions that he is going to be the greatest of the family, and he rubs it in. And then he goes through the mire, learns who God is, learns to truly appreciate God's blessings, and comes back up on the other side. That's his arc. Mixed in with this is an interesting story about Judah, which in some ways shows us both the character of Judah, how Joseph is the one who resists Potiphar's wife, but Judah is the one who gives in to the seeming prostitute at the side of the road. Joseph, who learns to be this faithful man. Judah, who does not keep his promise to Tamar. You know, these kind of contrasting characters, and how God is still using these people even though they're not completely healthy. So we have Judah here, who's this little sidetrack, but he's meant to show the contrast with Joseph in some ways, and how God uses both. Because later in the Bible, we're going to get especially to the book of Ruth, and we're going to see that Tamar becomes the lineage of David, how God uses this horrible story in the life of Judah, his folly, his fall, to bring about the kingdom of Israel. That's one of the things that we're going to see here in the future. The book of Genesis ends on kind of this mixed note. You get the high of the family all reunited. Jacob dies in peace, which, to die in peace is a wonderful thing. We don't appreciate that enough in our culture. But to die with peace in the family is a wonderful thing. And so the Bible's highlighting that element. But there's this ominous tone that Israel, the people, the group of people that is Jacob's family, are living outside of the land. They're not in the promised land. They're not under the shadow or I shouldn't say shadow there, should I? They're not under God's protection in the way they should be. Rather, they are at a place where there's the potential for evil. There's the potential for harm in Egypt. Egypt's king has already used this famine for political gain, where he has literally put all of his people in slavery. We have a tendency to gloss over this, but Joseph says to the people, they all come to Joseph to buy food, and they say, hey, we don't have any money. We've taken everything. Joseph says, okay, give me your land. And the next year they come and say, hey, we don't have anything. All we have is ourselves. And Joseph says, okay, you're slaves to the Pharaoh. So this Pharaoh, who's already willing to enslave his people, Israel's living with him. That sets us up for this with this little bit of an ominous tone for the next book. And so we'll leave it there for now. I hope, again, you're enjoying the videos. If you have comments or questions, please let me know. I'd love to do more of these. And beyond the book by book, if you have specific questions that I can help with, I will address those either in videos or in replies to questions, however I can. Until I see you again on Exodus, God bless.